Working on land projects can be difficult and challenging, especially when you have zoning and city governments that want to put their nose in things. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. I'm finishing up a very large land project. It's actually not that large. It's less than 10,000 square feet per each property. There's just 2 adjoining properties. It is following the Virginia management best practices for property. I'm following the forestry guidelines and the federal government's Clean Water Act guidelines as they are presented here in 2020. I'm actually, to be careful, following the Obama era Clean Water Act guidelines that were much more stringent, but President Trump has actually reversed some of those so that I don't have to worry about some of these details. The point I'm making, though, is that a land project can be very complex, and without the right planning, the right understanding, and hiring the right experts, you could end up in a load of trouble. So I replaced a retaining wall that was end of life. The retaining wall should have been replaced many years ago. It was a railroad tie built retaining wall in the woods. I was also having problems with trees falling on the house and falling around the property. It was these trees were a danger to the structures on the property. So what I did is I looked at the problem. The problem was heavy erosion. The problem was a end-of-life retaining wall. The problem was trees falling down. These mature trees were falling down due to the erosion and due to them being mature trees. And overall, the house was crowded. There was also bamboo on the property and a list as long as my arm of other problems that I was facing. Now, these problems were well known to me and my neighbors. Nobody else in the city knows about these problems unless they're also experiencing these problems. And I did talk with others who experienced these problems and got ideas about how they solve them. We have water issues in the basement because of the 44 inches of rain a year. How did other people solve that? We had trees falling. How did other people solve that? I brought in a physical engineer. I brought in an arborist. I brought in a forester. I brought in excavation companies. I brought in plumbing companies because there were sewer lines that needed to be replaced. Some of the groundwater that we were seeing and some of the moisture issues were actually due to 50-year-old sewer lines that were clay pipe lines, and they had roots in them. Long story short is I develop a plan to address this. You always want to start your land projects with a written plan. That written plan was then vetted. So I've even contacted Virginia Tech, University of Ohio, Ohio State University, University of North Carolina. I've worked with other organizations to get feedback on what's the best approach for my climate, for my geographic region, and my abilities. You know, what can I do with the technical services that are available? And then I execute the plan. The trees were timbered off the property. And so there's certain rules that you have to follow when you timber trees. There's certain grading that has to be in place afterwards. There's certain water management issues you have to consider. Earthen mound walls were built rather than a retaining wall because the earthen mound wall would allow us to expand the width of the backyard. See, I didn't really have a backyard. An earthen mound wall would let me expand the width of the backyard. If we built a stone wall or we built a gabion wall, for example, we wouldn't necessarily be able to have this expansion over time as easily because we wouldn't be able to, we'd have to dig up the wall every time you do the expansion. There's also cost concerns. What is your budget for this land project? What are you going to do first? What are you going to do second? If you have delays, like in my case, we had heavy rains, we had the COVID issue, we had tropical storms, we had a lot of issues like availability of contractors. If you're going to do the project in phases, what is the beginning, middle, and end of each phase so that at the end of the phase, we have a stable and a complete solution. Because when you're working with land, you want to be mindful of surface runoff. You want to be aware of how the new grading will interact with known factors such as rainstorms. What's the typical amount of rain that falls on the property? What's the square footage of the watershed? Now, all this does sound very complex. It sounds like a lot of work and effort, but ultimately, if you get the right professionals in place and you put together what's called a design plan, you very often can resolve many of these issues on paper because it's math. It's basically grading and elevations and basic math. We know how water works. We can figure it out on paper. Now, here's the thing. Many neighbors in your neighborhood don't have this complex background or understanding that you've invested in to know about the environmental factors, to know about the use of chemicals and how to design properties so you don't need herbicides. The issues related to you maintaining the property. I don't have a tractor. I want to maintain the property easy, so it needs to have level ramps on it rather than a deep pit. If you're not familiar with the videos I've done on my property, we actually had a 30-foot deep pit in the backyard because over the years there was a big trench eroded behind the property, and it's a factor of the neighbors' yards, but it's also a factor of the gutters off the main house. Long story short, when you put all this on paper, it starts to solidify. It starts to become more clear. It starts to become easier to follow. The problem is, though, that people observing what you're doing are not aware of the plan. They're not aware of the considerations. And when they see a detention pond, for example, they're like, why is he digging a pond in his backyard? Well, no, detention facilities are required with any land disturbance, especially if there's a grade involved. And the detention pond, the detention area or the detention facility or the detention pond will be there for a couple years before it either fills in with silt or it is filled in when the ground around the area is stable. When you put out grass to stabilize slopes, you're not going to immediately mow the grass. In fact, you couldn't even put turf on it. If you came out with turf and you layered it on the hill, you could not maintain that turf because it doesn't have the root mass far beneath the soil. But there was an unexpected mistake that I made. I was not aware of the political ramifications of doing such a dramatic change to a community. When the trees were cut down, I met one woman who panicked and was crying that I cut down the beautiful trees, that I have destroyed a natural ecosystem. Well, she didn't know that the trees were planted 30 or 40 years ago and they were intended to be cut down and replaced because there's furniture factories in the area. Now, the furniture factories went away, so the trees were never removed. There wasn't a market for the trees. I found a market for the trees, but there wasn't a general market for the trees, so they stayed up. And what was going to happen when you remove trees in a sustainable and an ethical way is that you immediately do grading after you remove the trees. You don't just cut down trees and leave stumps everywhere like a lot of people do in my region. You cut down the trees and then you regrade the property and then you replant trees or stabilization vegetation. Well, somebody looks at that who doesn't know these things, they panic. Oh my gosh, it looks like a construction site. Oh my gosh, you've torn up your entire yard. Oh my gosh, you've done, and they go and complain. And then when the city inspectors come out or the city individuals come out, the city inspector may understand what you're doing, but if they're receiving pressure from the city council or they're receiving pressure from other people in the neighborhood or they're receiving a list of constant complaints from people who don't understand what's going on, then they're going to come out and have to do something. Now, most times the city inspectors are studying these things and they could sign off on a plan and they'd work with engineers every day and they kind of have an idea of what's right and what's wrong in these situations. But they may not have the flexibility to do anything other than what their boss is asking for. So don't give these people a hard time when they come out. I have a problem that I have a big mouth. And sometimes I'll call it out as bullshit. I'll call it out as something that doesn't make any sense. That's not the right approach, and it does cause problems in my situation. The best approach is to have a design plan that you have conveyed to the inspector or conveyed to the city via someone familiar with all the damn paperwork that they're going to want. See, you can start a project without any paperwork and they'll let you get going. And then they're going to come along and say, well, you should have had a permit for this. You should have had a permit for that. In my particular case, I hired someone to tell me whether I needed a permit or not. And they told me no permit's necessary because of this, this, and this. Well, that's their interpretation. The official city interpretation could be something entirely different. These are challenges you're going to have to face. There are two factors here when we talk about Prosperity Homestead. One is you need the flexibility to just get up and go. If it's going to be too much trouble, if they're going to require things that are going to cost you way more than a house is worth, you really do need to just tidy it up and leave. Because if you stay around too long and they were able to make you do X, they're going to try to make you do Y. If they feel they have an extended power to shape and mold their community, it doesn't matter the person, they will always keep asking for more. And I'm especially frustrated when they ask for things that are sterile, canned landscape that doesn't respect the natural environment. It doesn't drive forward many of these environmental initiatives that are going forward. And even the recommendations of, say, the Audubon Society or the National Wildlife Federation, because, by the way, my yard is a certified wildlife habitat. Well, a certified wildlife habitat in the lines of English natural landscaping is actually very appealing to the majority of people. But if your leadership has in their mind a sterile yard that never changes, not understanding that every yard changes because you have subsoil erosion, you have surface erosion, you have impact of mowing, you have a lot of factors, you could still have problems. To avoid these problems again, a written design plan, hiring experts to come in and credentialize your plan, and then driving forward a pre-test on paper with your city. Now, when I went down to the city years ago and I said, here's what I'm thinking about doing, and they gave me some feedback, their default is not to change things. Their default is, well, you can't really do that, is not to change things. I adjust my plan to what they will allow and what they will not allow, but they're not going to say, well, you can do this, you can't do that. They're mostly going to say, you can't do this, you can't do that. That's why I went to credible experts in the area. That's why I went to the agricultural extension. That's why I went to the colleges and universities to solidify my plan. Now, I did make mistakes. I didn't go back and get their permission. I'm not the get their permission type of guy. I'm basically, if I'm following federal and state laws, then the local folks, they need to adjust their stuff because federal and state, are going to be, they're going to have jurisdiction over these temporary zoning things. And by the way, your zoning laws change all the time. My city has 300 pages of compliance-related items, some of which are contrary to the programs in which the city is participating and contrary to what is normal today. Like, for example, the neighborhood, the city next door, you can have backyard chickens. London, you can have backyard chickens. All of them have some restrictions, but essentially you can have small birds and no roosters. Here in Martinsville, Virginia, you can't do that unless you're out in the city. There are agricultural features that are being seen more and more in residential neighborhoods, like gardens, large gardens, like orchards, like composting. Well, it turns out those things are not officially welcome in the area in which I live, and so that causes challenges. But again, my larger point is that be aware that you're going to get pushback. What you're doing is unique. It's not unique if this was the 18th century. It's not unique if you were in Australia, for example. It's not unique if you were in a country that actually implements reasonable environmental and low impact type of items. But it is possible that some of the things that we prescribe or some of the things that we share here at Prosperity Homestead or Jeff Lawton shares or many of these permaculture folks share are not going to be welcome in your community, and you will get pushback. How you address that pushback matters. Don't be an ass like me. But essentially, they aren't trying to be a pain. And many of the people involved understand what you're doing, but the community is not ready for it because most people have been brainwashed into a lawn. They've been brainwashed into buying chemicals and mowing every day and having a team of people come out and clean things up. It doesn't need to be that way. In fact, the majority of American lawns suck up. They basically waste so much carbon and energy that we could have a whole different economy going if they were able to use the low energy methods, the low input methods, and the water safe methods that we use here at Prosperity Homestead. If you like more information about ethical land management, holistic methods for improving your local environment, and increasing property values, then visit www.prosperityhomestead.org, where we help small farms, homesteads, and estates transform their living spaces, improve lifestyle, and gain more quality and organic food and much more. Again, I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. Thanks for listening.